Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited about this lecture, and we're honored to show these letters that were donated to us by Dr. LaPera many years ago. My name is Lisa Colodoro. I'm the Executive Director here at the Italian Educational Cultural Center at Casa Colombo. So Casa Colombo was built in 1936 by Italian immigrants in order to teach their children about the Italian language and culture. We're also pleased today to have many of our board members. We have Carla, our Vice President. She will take on from here and tell you a little bit more.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. As you know, ICC Casa Colombo is the recipient and the custodian of this cultural heritage of Giuseppe Mazzini, and they were all bequested to us by the late Dr. Anthony Lepera, who with his brother Frank Lepera were the first supporter, promoter of ICC, of Italian Education Culture Centers in the late 80s, 90s. And of course, you know, most of the artifacts that were bequested by Italian Americans, like most of the artifacts in the Heritage Mastropiero Gallery, they're all donated by Italian Americans. Today we are honored and pleased to have the lecture on Giuseppe Mazzini, whom we all know was a true Italian nationalist. He was il padre del risorgimento italiano, il fautore, il promoter of the unification of Italy in 1861. So, here without any further ado, Professor William Connell, Professor of History and La Motta Endowment Chair of Italian Studies at Seton Hall Universities. Welcome and thank you.
And thanks to all of you for coming on a beautiful Saturday. It's an honor to be invited here to speak to you. It's my first time at Casa Colombo. I hope there will be more occasions. I'd like to start just by saying something that I sincerely believe. One of the most noble things that we can do as human beings is to preserve and interpret the past records and monuments of our civilization. Many thanks to Casa Colombo for engaging in this activity. Now, I'm going to be talking about what makes Giuseppe Mazzini special in history and in general terms about the American George Sanders, to whom two of the letters were addressed, plus one was addressed to his wife. But I'm going to begin by looking just at the letters themselves, what they offer, to start from the objects which were the occasion for this talk today. So let's treat them almost as though we've come across them in a drawer or in the back of a shop. And so we have here 4 letters. There are 3 of them in English, 1 in Italian. You can find the transcriptions on the side panel here, and the translation of the one in Italian. They were written by the Italian patriot Giuseppe Mazzini, who was in the 1850s living in exile in London. How did the letters get here? I've made some inquiries with a historian in Massachusetts who's edited many of Mazzini's letters. And so far, none of these 4 has been published, so they're not known to historians until now. And they do offer new details about Mazzini's life in the 1850s. In 2012, Dr. Lepera gave the letters to Casa Colombo. How did he get them? Well, at some point in time, 3 of them certainly belonged to the Sanders family archive. That is the papers of George Sanders and then his descendants. Those are all now deposited at the Library of Congress in Washington, which purchased them from the Sanders family in 1914. So those 3 letters somehow became separated from all of the papers that went to the Library of Congress. Could have been sold or taken out before they went to the Library of Congress, or someone could have stolen them from the Library of Congress, but who knows? Okay. But they enter the private market as does happen. Those 3 written in English were in private possession when Dr. Lepera acquired them. The 4th letter, written in Mazzini's Italian, must also have been acquired privately. How valuable are they? That's something that people often ask. To begin with something like this, and someone like Giuseppe Mazzini in the 19th century would have written thousands upon thousands of letters. Think of how many emails you write today. This was the major way of communicating, and he had a vast international network. Just Googling, you will find that there are Mazzini letters out there for sale today. And the price can range from $100, $200 to $2,000, maybe. It's something really special or written to an important person. But as a historian, there are other considerations. That is, a $100 letter could still actually be valuable to a historian. One important thing, of course, is that Mazzini was and still is famous. So that raises the value of the letters for collectors. I checked in Google Maps, and there are 4,000 streets with the name Mazzini in Italy today. Okay, it's the 4th most numerous. The biggest, the most common is Via Roma, and there are about 8,000 Via Romas. And then Garibaldi and Marconi, but Mazzini is number 4 in all of the municipalities in Italy. And that's a nice indication of how famous he is. And these things matter to collectors. There are collectors who like to have autographs from different people. You know, a letter of George Washington, a letter of Mazzini, a letter of Garibaldi, and so forth. So that's also how they circulate. But as I said, for a historian, the value is somewhat different. And letters are especially wonderful for the data points they give us. Names of individuals and places, indications of plans, where people are going, what they're hoping to accomplish. And most wonderfully, most of them are dated. So that gives especially solid information when constructing timelines of events. It's important to remember that causation and correlation are different things, but there's an iron law of causation that's important in history, which is that something that came afterward can't have caused something that came before. So if you can get a date, it's actually important because it excludes the possibility of all of those, of having caused all of those things that came before. So, okay. What's especially interesting about these 4 letters is that they are all from the 1850s. I've skipped some slides. I haven't been, this is, we all know where we are. Next slide. Here are our two main protagonists, Mazzini and George Sanders, on these photographic cards that were fairly common in the second half of the 19th century, with their signatures, of course, next. And these are our 4 letters that are on pedestals around the room. And then the next. Here's the Via Mazzini, the most popular. This is from Verona. But And then here we go. It's just the dates. So these are the dates of our letters in the 1850s, and you'll notice kind of big picture, we're on the eve of two major events. And I'll be getting to those later in the lecture. But the Wars of Unification of 1859-61 and the American Civil War, 1861-1865. The writers didn't know yet what would happen, but these details give us a sense of what they're worried about, what might happen, and that's a special thing. These details are like like I said, names, dates. They're like the tiles of a mosaic. And so you can, from a bunch of letters and newspaper clippings, so put together a rich picture. Okay, letter number 1. Next slide. It's sent by Mazzini in July 1854, addressed to the American George Sanders. It was a time of disappointment for both men. Mazzini thanks Sanders for the zeal you are displaying in our cause. And Mazzini's great goal was nothing less than to bring about a great revolution throughout Italy that would overthrow the country's monarchies and unify Italy under a single democratic republic. But things were not going well for Mazzini. Next slide. In 1848, throughout Europe, from 1848 to 1850, there were a series of failed revolutions. And Mazzini had won the attention of the whole world in 1859 when he and his buddy Giuseppe Garibaldi seized the city of Rome, proclaimed a new Roman Republic, thinking back to ancient times, a new Roman Republic. Pius IX, the Pope, fled the city, and it seemed like there were huge possibilities. But, next slide. In 1850, from France, Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, who was just elected president, and would soon proclaim himself emperor, as Emperor Napoleon III, sent French troops down to Italy, and they suppressed the Roman Republic, and Mazzini and Garibaldi went into exile. So Mazzini finds himself in England now in 1854 when he writes this letter. In the letter, Mazzini explains to Sanders he's been working with fellow revolutionaries who aren't so sympathetic in helping someone called Crispian. Next slide. Yeah. And his agents are being arrested everywhere, he says, and he ends by asking for help securing 2,000 muskets for Sicily or Naples that would be paid for after a successful revolution in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. More muskets, he says, could be stored in Tunis and then brought across the Mediterranean. Crispian, if we go to the next slide, was his anglicized name for his follower, then a young man, Francesco Crispi, who came from Sicily. And he was busy trying to Italianize Sicily in the 1850s. That is, get the Sicilians to feel more Italian and then join in this larger Italian revolution. That was Crispi's goal. So his mention here is interesting, but also the mention that the other revolutionaries aren't so sympathetic to this. Next slide. Sanders. What's going on with his life? Well, he had recently received bad news from the United States when he received this letter. A Kentuckian by birth, a former congressman from South Carolina, he had previously been American consul in Havana, Cuba. And in 1853, President Pierce had appointed him acting American consul in London. Now, as consul in London, he was somewhat controversial. he immediately reached out to a series of anti-monarchical European revolutionaries. Revolutionaries from France, Hungary, and Italy, including Mazzini. So there's the representative of the American government hanging out with these guys. He even had a banquet for them on George Washington's birthday. But he's presenting this notion of America as the democratic republic, a kind of a model for these revolutionaries in Europe who also want to establish democratic republics. But he's quite open about this kind of stuff. And he already had a history of this sort of work. During the Paris uprising of 1848, he tried to bring in a bunch of guns left over from the US-Mexican War to Paris. And when he got there, he helped personally to build street barricades. The next slide, like in Les Mis, okay? This is the American, now he's the American consul in London, but he had been congressman from South Carolina. He's there building barricades in Paris. And in London, he gave a speech talking about creating a new steam-powered guillotine that would complete the work of the earlier French Revolution's reign of terror in eliminating the aristocracy. So he's a kind of wild man. We sometimes see today in these podcasts and stuff and the internet, but here he is, the official representative of the American government, publishing a letter in the London Times as consul, calling for the assassination of Napoleon III, the ruler of France. Okay, something he probably regretted having done. But the next slide. Word of these undiplomatic activities alarmed people in Washington. So when his appointment as acting consul came up for formal approval, the Senate voted him down 49-10. But he continued to have a large network in the Democratic Party, in the U.S. and in Europe. So he'd been voted down in February, and now this letter is from the summer. And so after he was sacked as consul, he remains in England, and that's when Mazzini writes to him. And Mazzini's question about the muskets shows how well it was known at that time that the Department of War, which is what they called it back in the 1800s, had a large number of old smooth-barreled muskets to dispose of, because new rifled muskets with a barrel that would cause the bullet to spin were replacing them. So they had all of these old guns, and so that's what Mazzini's asking for. And Sanders was probably shopping them around while he was there. He moved to Belgium in 1854, so a few months after this letter, and there he got together a bunch of Democratic Party politicians, including James Buchanan, the future President of the United States, to sign what was called the Ostend Manifesto, drawn up in Belgium, that proposed that the United States should either purchase Cuba from Spain or take the island by force. He was an audacious guy. Right. But there was seriousness to this stuff too. He wasn't just looking for eyeballs in the media. He was instead he had a vision, an expansionist vision of the United States that we'll get back to. So we'll move more quickly through the subsequent letters. Letter number 2, written in Italian, 1855. A letter of introduction to the keeper of the British Museum. Then next slide, please. Next, the largest library in England, and the famous reading room where intellectuals would hang out. And this is a letter recommending the brother of a friend that was a military leader in Argentina that Mazzini hoped would replace or be a substitute for Garibaldi, if Garibaldi somehow left the movement. Next slide, third letter. This is to Anna Sanders, his wife. Okay, we looked Lisa and Olivia also looked for a portrait of Anna, the wife, and we couldn't find her. But she was an important person. Even as a young lady, at the age of 20 in New York, she belonged to an important New York family. She published what she said would be the first of a poetry and prose journal with fictional pieces and speeches and things like that. Her father was an impressive hero in the War of 1812, and he's the one who came up with the design of the flag with 13 stripes, red and white, to represent the 13 original colonies, and then adding a star with every new state that joined the United States. So she's from this prominent family, and there's a list of the subscribers at the end of this first number. I think it's the only number of this thing that she edited when she was 20 years old, and you have former governors of New York, mayors of New York, the high clergy, very, very impressive, the number of 80 people all paying $5 a year to subscribe to this young lady's literary effort. She was an intelligent woman. She followed her husband's political activities and kept for decades a valuable diary that's preserved in the Library of Congress. Mazzini's letter to her refers to French and Hungarian revolutionaries by their nicknames. He also refers to George's battle. Now we're in 1858, and this probably refers to the splintering of the Young American Movement and the Democratic Party in the wake of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and I'll be explaining those things later. But more interesting than that, in this third letter, Mazzini says that he's come back from traveling incognito in Italy. He's in exile, but for 4 months. Why did that happen? Well, I'm checking on the historical record. In January 1858, a former associate of Mazzini's named Felice Orsini arranged an attack on none other than Napoleon III, the man that Sanders had said in 1854 ought to be assassinated. It was a really horrific terrorist episode. 3 bombs were thrown at the emperor and his wife. 8 people died. 156 people were wounded, but the emperor and his wife got off. Orsini had recently broken his relations with Mazzini. So Mazzini wasn't involved in the plot, but certainly he would have been suspected, right? And so he obviously, he took this occasion to hightail it from London, where the French were already protesting and the English were harboring so many revolutionaries. And he traveled in disguise in Italy for 4 months till things died down. And then when he gets back, he starts writing to his friends. And this is a letter that basically says things are okay. And he's writing to the wife of the guy who said that Napoleon should be assassinated. It was interesting. All right, fourth letter. Recommendation of a female patriot that Mazzini said would make a splendid representative of Italian patriotic goals if she could be invited to the U.S., and a recommendation of a musician with like a U.S. passport. So not so interesting. Next slide. Now let's look at the larger story. Named George's Battle. Next slide. This is the assassination attempt in Paris. Here's the coach with Napoleon III and his wife, and then you can just see these horrific bombs that didn't reach the carriage, but killed all of these other people. Next slide. And that's next slide. So these are, remember, we're on the eve of some great events. And next slide. This is what Italy looked like after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. There's a restoring of many of the old territorial boundaries. But everywhere there are now monarchies. The old republics of Genoa, Venice, and Lucca are now ruled by the king of Sardinia, the duke here, and Lombardy and the Veneto are part of the provinces of the Austrian Empire. This is the Italy that Mazzini wanted to unify. Who was he? He was born in Genoa, 1805. He began his university studies at the age of 14. He began writing for newspapers, and in 1827, at the age of 22, he joined a chapter of the movement known as the Carbonari. Next slide. Next slide. The Carbonari were an offshoot of Freemasonry, and they would meet in lodges and in secret, but they had a particular political drive. Next slide. You can see that they're using Masonic symbols in their documents. Next slide. Which was to replace the monarchies with constitutional, to have the monarchies have written constitutions, so they'd get the king to write out the constitution so that you actually knew who was a citizen, what the rights of the citizen were, what the limitations were on the monarch power, or to create a republic. Mazzini himself was involved in this last revolt of the Carbonari here he was arrested in 1830. In 1831, he was released, and rather than go to a forced confinement in a small village in the mountains, he chose exile into Switzerland and then to France and then to England. And it's with the failure of this 1831 revolt. Think about it, we're now 15 years after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. These organizations just haven't been gaining much traction or getting anywhere. Mazzini changes everything. He hits upon the ideas that would guide his activity for the rest of his life. Very importantly, from next slide. Next slide. He establishes an organization called Young Italy, Giovine Italia. And using this organization, he understood that it was easier to construct a nationwide organization from outside of Italy. So they wouldn't be subject to regulation and checking by these small monarchies that wanted to preserve their rule. So actually being in exile was a plus. And in England, where there was freedom of the press, you could print all of the explosive stuff that you wanted, and then you could send it through an increasingly improved postal service, now that the Napoleonic Wars were all over, and also sea trade was booming, and so you could get Italian sailors, most famously Garibaldi, for instance, to distribute this literature and take it with them when they came into port. So you could print out lots of stuff and pamphlets, speeches, manifestos, and distribute it nationwide. So someone in Sicily would read the same thing that was received in Venice or in Genoa. He understood that. He understood that Young Italy, it's a brand. Young. Those Carbonari were getting old. They're still, it's 15 years they've been hanging out, and they've been Freemasons before that, and their revolutions have all been killed. Now, instead, we're going to bring in a whole new generation of people, people who hadn't experienced the Napoleonic Wars, but instead give them a positive vision of a united Italy. Central to Mazzini's ideas was the notion that for everybody, there's something remarkable in a nation state. Not just Italy, but for any people to be able to have a government that's for them is a remarkable thing, as opposed to an empire that has 10 or 12 nationalities like the Austrian Empire. And Austria was one of the real enemies here because they had Lombardy and the Veneto as provinces. States he understood are just governments, right? So you can have a state anywhere, but a nation state is one that belongs to a people. And when it belongs to a particular people that have a national consciousness, that state is going to be more effective. It's easier to build highways and railroads and telegraph lines. It's easier to have a national policy concerning tariffs, concerning trade, and if everybody feels part of it, if it's a democratic republic, it really becomes a vehicle for progress into the future, which everybody participates in this feeling and in the activity of the state. Instead of there just being a prince saying do this and do that, and everybody following him in a kind of hierarchical pyramid. So a nation state with its own of a people that have a history, blood relations, a language, religion, folk traditions, governed as a democratic republic, not as a hereditary monarchy, is one that the citizens will fight for, they'll defend and be proud to belong to. He had a historical vision. He said that the 18th century, 1700s, was the time when it was established that individual rights could be a standard. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to own property. The 19th century, he said, was going to be the time when social rights were created. The right of whole people to have their own state, as opposed to individual rights that preceded. And he said, with this nation state, you'll be able to achieve remarkable things. This is when tunnels are start to be dug under the Alps, railroads are being built, literacy is spreading among the common folk. And it coincided with this notion, with the contemporary progress, the idea of the nation state. And here, next slide, we come somewhat surprisingly to George Sanders. George Sanders was the leader of the movement in this country that called itself Young America. From its founding in 1831, Mazzini's Young Italy inspired movements throughout Europe and in the United States and Latin America. So you have the young Poland, the young Hungary, young Germans, the young Turks eventually will adopt that in Turkey. And it's like there's this idea of we're a new generation. We're pushing ahead. All of that the Napoleonic Wars, all of the stuff of the 18th century, we're putting behind us. We're moving ahead. We have imagine the locomotive as the symbol of what's happening in the 19th century. And in the United States, with the decline of the Whig Party and the success of the patriotic war against Mexico, there were these huge possibilities for growth and expansion that the Young America movement capitalized on. They openly pointed to Mazzini for inspiration. And America stood out as the example of a successful democratic republic, which was exactly what Mazzini wanted for Italy. And so for a brief period, late 1840s, early 1850s, the Young America movement brought together two pretty different groups under the banner of progress and manifest destiny. One group were northern commercial expansionists, people who wanted to move west, build those railroads, use the river network in the center of the country to build industries and to export. And then you had southern agrarian expansionists who were also interested in expanding slave territories to the west. So these groups come together in late 1840s, early 1850s, and slavery is seen as a sort of minor thing. Sanders himself tried to downplay slavery as a problem between the North and the South. His answer was, we'll grow out of it. Move west, build, and progress, the economics of slavery will change. And he said, look, the slaves themselves, as we move west, we white Americans, the slaves are moving east to Liberia, he said. So he's just trying to, he's a Kentuckian and a congressman from South Carolina, which are slave areas, and so he just tries to downplay slavery, but it would come back and as an issue again and hurt them. Especially with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the founding of a Republican Party. The contradictions between the northern industrialists and the southern agrarian young Americans split the party, and it split the Democratic Party. So you actually had, and the split in the Democratic Party was what enabled President Lincoln to be elected with less than 50% of the vote in 1860. And so as things got worse and worse in terms of north-south problems, and the Northerners terrified by the idea of Southern secession because they relied on the Ohio-Mississippi nexus to export products from the Midwest. The Midwest risked being, essentially, the Northern Midwest risked being cut off if the South seceded. And so the Young American movement was essentially doomed in the 1850s, but Sanders was the one who published its newspaper, who was out there trying to hold it together. The last of our four letters today, 1858, it's after that the relations with Mazzini must have started falling off. You have Lincoln elected in 1860, and the Southern states secede in 1861, and Sanders opts to support the Confederacy. True to his aggressive approach, always wanting to be involved, to be there in the action where it's happening, he signed on as an agent for the Confederacy, and from Canada, he would relay messages and hire agents among the Copperheads in New York, supporters of the Confederacy there. And in 1865, after Lincoln's assassination, the man who in 1854 called for the assassination of Napoleon III was immediately arrested and charged with having been involved in the plot to kill Lincoln, which turned out to be not true, and he was proved innocent and let go. So that's what happens with Sanders. Mazzini, though, next slide. He came down on the side of the Union. For him there, the deciding issue really was slavery. Throughout his career, he insisted on human liberty and dignity for everyone. But there's an interesting issue here. One that Sanders and like-minded Southerners were trying to bring up in trying to persuade someone like Mazzini to support them. Mazzini's nationalism, national independence, actually involved something that's actually the same thing, which can be called secession. There's this double nature between independence and secession, right? Independence sounds great. To the British, the 13 colonies seceded from the empire. And what Mazzini was calling for was for Lombardy and Veneto to secede from the Austrian Empire. And his friends in Hungary, in Poland, they were all trying to secede from the Austrian Empire. And the Southerners could make a case that they had a particular culture and tradition and history that was, and this is what they said, was different from that of the northern United States. So there's this, so although independence is a great word for us, and secession we see as a kind of word involving traitorous activity, it's a kind of double-edged thing. Even Mazzini, at the end of his life, in 1870, he was so upset, still a democratic republican, he's so upset with the monarchical kingdom of Italy and the way it was treating Sicily that he tried to organize a secession of Sicily from the unified kingdom of Italy. So it's maybe a sobering thought, but if it had not been for the problem of slavery, Mazzini might very well have supported the Confederacy. But that moral imperative was what brought him to support Lincoln and the Union. I could end it there, but I have there's a kind of personal story that I'm going to bring up now, partly personal. Next slide. He's the fourth most common name in the street name, but he's a failure everywhere, again and again. And you can see the intense activity because each one of these conspiracies involved rounding up followers, gathering guns, explosives, plotting out who's going to be where. Think of just all of the work that goes into plotting an assassination or seizing a government. But again and again, boom, 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 all the way to the end when he dies. After they find him trying to start a revolt in Sicily, they put him in prison, but he's then released. And it's 1872 when he died. He was traveling incognito again in Pisa, So in the country that he envisaged, that he is considered a co-equal founder with Garibaldi and Camillo Cavour, the Prime Minister of Sardinia. He died traveling incognito in his own country. It's a tragic story. Okay. Now. Next slide. You may not know it, but among Italians it's fairly common knowledge. There's a kind of appreciation, an affectionate way of acknowledging also his importance. His reputation, even while alive, was that of a jettatore, someone bears the evil eye. Someone who has a jinx. Okay. The malocchio, it's wrong. Okay. And you're thinking, he's the fourth most common name. But there are Italians who try not to pronounce his name. They call him Signor M. the person who shall not be named sometimes, you know, he who shall not be named. And there's this tradition in Italy that with a person who has the evil eye, you know, bad things can happen. You can shake their hand and have a heart attack, or a chandelier will fall. There are famous stories of this. The next slide. Here we have the president of the Republic of Italy when cholera broke out in Naples. And the way, everybody please do this now, the way to ward off the evil eye is to make the corona this way. Okay? Yeah, pointed down. Pointed down, and you sometimes you touch iron. Okay. And next slide. This is a charm that coral charm that my wife has on her charm. And next slide. Now, this means that I'm sleeping with your wife. It's the cuckold's horns as opposed to the horns of the white boy. So somebody over here with a spoon. So don't do this. Be safe and do this. Next one. Sergio Leone was famous as a jettatore, and a friend of mine describes after the earthquake in Naples, 81, how Sergio Leone was one of the celebrities who came into the hospital, and you could see on the television screen that the patients in beds were all going like this. So you see, it's often famous people who are considered to have this jinx. Okay. It doesn't mean they're terrible people. In a way, they're sort of strange. They're strangely victims of this odd thing. Next slide. The famous philosopher in Naples, Benedetto Croce, had this wonderful quote. I don't believe in it, but I take my precautions. Okay. Which has become my attitude too. So please, next slide. This is the personal story. So I was giving my very first lecture in Berkeley as a PhD student. I was asked to give a guest lecture in the European History Survey about the unification of Italy. It was the largest lecture hall on campus. It holds 400 students. And I had prepared my lecture, including a little bit about how Mr. M was a jettatore. And so the students were all laughing at this fact. And I had a big slide of Mr. M projected at the back of the screen behind me. And I was about 20 minutes into the lecture, the photo was back there, and suddenly, and the students had been laughing, suddenly the students they were all getting up and leaving the lecture hall. You can imagine, this is my very first time lecturing in a European history class, and they're all abandoning my lecture. And I didn't understand what happened, so I went to Mr. Slotman, who was the professor who had invited me in, and I said, what happened? Why did they all leave? And with Mr. M projected back here, he walked me down into the center of he said, you don't know what it is? I said, no. He walked me into the center of the auditorium, and there was this thick smell, like asphalt and sulfur, okay? And so if you consider that there's this sort of smoky smell and a picture of Mr. M in the back, it's like that scene in Don Giovanni where the commendatore comes up. And it turned out they were doing roofing work and hadn't turned off the ventilation shafts. So But there's a case where, maybe the jinx holds, and I can say that. So I told friends this story, and I was telling the story to one friend, and I got a call from my wife that the lights had fallen on her a mile away, in just track lights in the ceiling had fallen on her while I was telling the story. And we went to Thanksgiving dinner 2 months later, and the host got up and didn't come back from the bathroom. We went in, and I was telling the story again about the famous story, because everybody laughs when I tell them about this, and tell them about Sarah Julie and things like that. He was in a pool of blood. There had been one of those, get up suddenly and their blood pressure, but his chin hit the basin in the bathroom, and so basically, do this. Take your precautions, but so I don't know if there's another slide. Yeah, here we have. So there's that I'll end there then.